Case 1. Number 1. Mark Barton. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who walks into a room full of people he once called colleagues, greets them with a smile, and then tears their world apart without a second thought. Not a word of warning, not a flicker of hesitation, just a calm, ordinary afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, that became one of the darkest days in the history of American workplaces. The year was 1999, and the name Mark Barton would soon be etched into the memory of a nation that had never seen anything quite like it. Mark Orrin Barton was born on April 2nd, 1955, into an Air Force family. His father, Truman Barton, was stationed abroad, and so young Mark spent parts of his early childhood in Europe before the family eventually settled in Sumter, South Carolina. By most outward accounts, he was intelligent. He attended Clemson University and later the University of South Carolina. But intelligence, as many people have painfully learned, says nothing about what lives beneath the surface of a person. And what lived beneath the surface of Mark Barton was something that would take decades to fully reveal itself. Barton married his first wife, Deborah Spivey, and together they had 2 children, a son named Matthew and a daughter named Elizabeth Michelle. The marriage, however, was turbulent. Barton grew increasingly paranoid and controlling, and the relationship deteriorated over time. Then, on September 5, 1993, Deborah Spivey and her mother, Eloise, were found dead, both killed by blunt force trauma. Barton was the prime suspect. Investigators looked closely at him, but without sufficient physical evidence, no charges were filed. He walked free, and here's where the story takes on a chill that is hard to shake. After his first wife's passing, Barton received a life insurance settlement of $294,000. He used that money to fund what would become an obsession with day trading. He remarried in 1995, this time to a woman named Lee and Vandiver. By all appearances, he was simply a man trying to rebuild. He moved to Stockbridge, Georgia, a quiet suburb south of Atlanta, and threw himself into the volatile world of online stock trading. Day trading, for those unfamiliar, is a high-stake financial activity where individuals buy and sell stocks within the same trading day, chasing rapid gains. It requires nerves of steel and extraordinary discipline. Barton had neither. Over the months leading up to the summer of 1999, he had lost a staggering $105,000. Momentum Securities, one of the firms he traded with, had already canceled his account. The pressure was mounting. The losses kept coming, and something inside him, already fractured for years, finally gave way completely. On the night of July 27, 1999, while Lee slept, Barton ended her life. He then wrote her a note, covered her body, and the following morning, he turned to his children. Matthew was 11. Michelle was 8. He left notes on their bodies for police to find. And then he waited. For 2 full days, he moved through the world as if nothing had happened, as if the apartment behind him was not holding the most devastating secret imaginable. On July 29, 1999, Barton arrived at Momentum Securities in the Buckhead district of Atlanta. He chatted with traders. He laughed. He was relaxed. Then, just after 3 in the afternoon, he pulled out 2 handguns. Within minutes, 4 people were dead. He walked out, crossed a 6-lane road, and entered the nearby All-Tech Investment Group. He lured 2 managers and a secretary into a private room, telling them he had something they would want to see. He opened fire, wounding all 3. He then walked back into the main trading floor and continued. 5 more people lost their lives. In total, 9 people were killed at the 2 offices and 13 others were wounded. One survivor, Kathy Van Camp, endured 15 surgeries in the years that followed and permanently lost her sight. A citywide manhunt lasted nearly 5 hours. Police scrambled across Atlanta. SWAT teams flooded Buckhead. Residents were told to lock their doors. Then, at a gas station in Ackworth, Georgia, some 30 miles northwest of the city, officers surrounded Barton's dark green minivan. With nowhere left to go, Mark Barton took his own life. He was 44 years old. He left behind a note. In it, he spoke of people who had, in his words, greedily sought his destruction. He expressed regret for taking Lee's life. He claimed he killed his children to spare them the pain of a life without parents. What he never did, in all those carefully chosen words, was take full responsibility. Even at the very end, the accounting was incomplete. And the 9 people whose lives ended in those offices on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in Atlanta never got the explanation they deserved. Case 2. Joseph Stack 3. Most people who reach a breaking point do one of 2 things. They either pull back from the edge or they crumble quietly where no one could see. But every so often, someone chooses a third path. One so extreme, so calculated, and so permanent that the entire country stops to watch the wreckage. Andrew Joseph Stack, 3, did not write a goodbye letter to his family. He did not walk into a therapist's office or call a helpline. He wrote a 6-page document addressed to the government that he believed had ruined him, set fire to his own home, climbed into a single-engine aircraft, and flew it into a federal building. What makes his story so difficult to simply dismiss is not the destruction he left behind. It is how many people quietly understood, at least in part, the fury that drove him there. Andrew Joseph Stack, 3, was born on August 31st, 1956, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He was orphaned at the age of 4 and spent formative years in a Catholic orphanage before attending the Milton Hershey School, a charitable boarding institution for children from low-income families. He later studied engineering at Harrisburg Area Community College, but did not complete his degree. He was bright, technically minded, and deeply independent, qualities that serve him well in a career as an embedded software consultant, but that also fed a stubborn refusal to accept circumstances he viewed as unjust. Stack's grievances with the Internal Revenue Service stretched back years. He believed the tax code was deliberately designed to punish working people while protecting the wealthy and politically connected. He had experienced tax disputes, financial penalties, and what he described as an unrelenting system that took without giving anything back. These frustrations did not appear overnight. They built slowly over decades, accumulating the way pressure does when there is no valve to release it. His first marriage, to a woman named Ginger Stack, ended in divorce. He remarried, settled in Austin, Texas, and continued working as a software consultant. On the surface, his life in the Schofield Farms neighborhood appeared ordinary. Behind closed doors, the resentment was reaching a point of no return. The night before February 18, 2010, Stack posted a lengthy manifesto online that amounted to a final reckoning with every institution he felt had wronged him. He wrote about decades of financial struggle, about tax laws that he believed existed solely to serve the powerful, about a government that he saw as fundamentally broken and dishonest. He signed a note, Joe Stack, 1956 to 2010. The timestamp made it clear he already knew how the next morning would end. On the morning of February 18, 2010, Stack set fire to his home on Daplegary Lane in North Austin. His wife and young daughter had already left the house. He watched the structure burn, then drove 15 miles to Georgetown Municipal Airport. There, he boarded his single-engine Piper Cherokee PA-28, a plane he had owned since 1998, topped off its fuel tank, and took off without filing a flight plan. He flew under rules that required no contact with air traffic control. No one watching from the ground would have had any reason to be alarmed, until the aircraft dropped low and pointed itself directly at the Echelon I office building at 9420 Research Boulevard in Northwest Austin. At approximately 9:58 in the morning, the plane tore into the first floor of the 7-story building. The impact created an enormous fireball. Thick black smoke poured from the second and third floors. Nearly 200 IRS employees worked inside that building. People who saw the plane approaching had only seconds to warn their colleagues before the crash shook the structure to its foundation. Ceilings caved in. Windows blew out. Employees ran through smoke-filled corridors trying to find a way out. A former Army combat engineer who happened to be driving past used an extension ladder from his work truck to pull 6 people from the second floor to safety. 13 people were injured, 2 of them critically. One man, IRS Revenue Officer Group Manager Vernon Hunter, 68 years old and a Vietnam War veteran, did not make it out. He became the human cost of one man's private war against a system he felt had consumed his entire life. Stack also perished in the impact he had orchestrated. In the aftermath, investigators spent weeks piecing together the full scope of what had happened. The IRS subsequently spent more than $38 million responding to the attack and increasing security at offices across the country. 2 F-16 aircraft were launched over Austin as a precautionary measure. The White House confirmed that the incident did not appear to be an act of organized terrorism. What it was instead was something harder to categorize. One man's total collapse carried out in full view of the sky above Texas. Case 3. Amy Bishop. There's a version of ambition that the world celebrates, the kind that pushes a person through late nights, through setbacks, through years of sacrifice in pursuit of something that feels worth it. And then there is another version, one that curdles quietly when it does not get what it wants, one that sits in a room full of colleagues for 30 minutes, steady and silent, and then pulls a weapon from a purse and opens fire. What is it inside a human being that allows them to make that turn? And what does it say about the thin line between drive and destruction? Amy Bishop's story does not offer easy answers, but it does offer a warning that most people, even those closest to her, never saw coming. Amy Bishop was born on April 24th, 1965, in Braintree, Massachusetts, into an educated family. Her father, Samuel Bishop, was a professor in the art department at Northeastern University in Boston. And from an early age, Amy absorbed an atmosphere that placed enormous value on intellectual achievement. She attended Braintree High School and later completed her undergraduate degree at Northeastern University before going on to earn her doctorate in genetics from Harvard University. Harvard, the credential alone, tells you something about the depth of her academic drive. She was not a mediocre student who stumbled into academia. She was someone who had worked relentlessly to reach the highest levels of the field, and she believed with total conviction that she belonged there. She married her husband, James Anderson, while the two were undergraduates together at Northeastern. They built a life around her academic career, eventually settling in Huntsville, Alabama, after she joined the biology department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville in 2003. She was a researcher, a teacher, and a mother of 4 children. Those who work alongside her in her early years at UH describe her as eccentric and sometimes difficult, but also as someone with a genuine passion for science. She had developed a device called a cell hysteria, a lab tool she believed had commercial potential, and she carried the dual identity of serious academic and aspiring entrepreneur. On the surface, her life looked like a portrait of a woman who had made it. But underneath, a storm had been building for years. In March of 2009, UH denied Amy Bishop tenure, the institutional decision that determines whether a professor stays permanently or is eventually shown the door. It was not a subtle outcome. Tenure denial, particularly for someone who had invested as much as Bishop had, carries a weight that is difficult to overstate. It signals that the institution does not see your work as good enough, and that your time there has an expiration date. Bishop did not accept the decision. She hired an attorney and filed an appeal, which was also denied. By the spring of 2010, her final semester at the university was underway, and the clock was running out on the academic life she had built over decades. On February 12, 2010, the biology department held a routine faculty meeting in room 369 of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology on the UH campus. Approximately 12 to 13 people sat around an oval table discussing course scheduling, enrollment numbers, and budgets. It was, by every account, one of the most unremarkable meetings the department had ever held. Amy Bishop sat among them, quiet, composed, giving no indication that anything was wrong. She had been there for 30 to 40 minutes when she stood up, reached in her bag, and pulled out a Ruger P95 9mm handgun. She moved methodically down the table, targeting the colleagues nearest to her. 3 people lost their lives that afternoon. Biology Department Chairman Gopi K. Patala, Professor Maria Ragland Davis, and Professor Audrey L. Johnson. 3 others were wounded, including Professor Joseph Leahy, who suffered a serious head injury and later lost partial vision in one eye, staff aide Stephanie Monticciolo, and Assistant Professor Louise Cruz Vera. A colleague, Biochemistry Professor Deborah Moriarty, looked Bishop in the eyes and begged her to stop. Bishop pointed the weapon at her and pulled the trigger. The gun either jammed or ran out of ammunition. Moriarty survived. Bishop walked into the hallway, called her husband to come and pick her up, and was apprehended by campus police before she could leave the building. What investigators uncovered afterward added layers that the public had never expected. In December of 1986, Amy Bishop had fatally shot her 18-year-old brother, Seth, in the family home in Braintree. Authorities at the time ruled it accidental and released her without charges. That decision haunted the case for the rest of her life. On September 24, 2012, Amy Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, where she will spend the rest of her days. Case 4. Jinghua Wu. Silicon Valley has always been sold to the world as a place where brilliance is rewarded, where the right combination of talent and persistence opens every door. What that story leaves out is everything that happens to the people who give everything they have and still end up on the wrong side of the door when it closes. What it never mentions is what years of pressure, displacement, and shame can quietly do to a human mind. Jinghua Wu was not a household name before November 14th, 2008. He was simply a test engineer, an immigrant who had built a life in one of the most competitive industries on Earth. Then he was let go. And in the hours that followed that single decision, 3 people who came to work that morning did not go home. Jinghua Wu was born in China around 1961 or 62, during one of the most turbulent chapters in that country's modern history. He grew up in the era of the Cultural Revolution, a period marked by upheaval, fear, and deep social instability. Those who later represented him in court would argue that the environment of his childhood left lasting psychological damage. That the world Wu grew up in was one where security could vanish without warning and survival depended on an almost compulsive need to hold on to whatever stability a person could find. Whether or not that fully explains what he eventually became, it matters as context. Because the man who arrived in Silicon Valley was not someone without a story. He was someone carrying one that was heavier than most people around him ever knew. Wu was employed as a test engineer at Seaport Incorporated, a semiconductor startup based in Santa Clara, California. The company specialized in HD radio chip technology, and Wu had been part of the engineering team working to advance that product. He was not a peripheral employee, but in the weeks leading up to November 2008, the company had decided to let him go. Wu did not accept this quietly. He had gone back to management more than once, pleading for an extension, asking for more time to prove his value. He described the experience of begging for his job as one of the most humiliating moments of his life, feeling, in his own words, like a dog begging for a bone. The shame of that, layered on top of everything else he was carrying, appears to have reached a point beyond what he was able to hold. On the morning of November 14th, 2008, Wu attended a meeting at Seaport's offices. The termination was confirmed. He was no longer employed there. What investigators later established is that after that morning meeting, Wu went out and purchased 100 rounds of ammunition for his 9mm pistol. He then returned to Seaport's offices at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He walked directly into the office of CEO Sid Agrawal. Witnesses outside the room heard the conversation that followed. Agrawal told him to calm down. He told Wu they could work it out. Wu's response, heard clearly by at least one witness, was simple and final. He said he did not care and that he was going to jail anyway. What followed lasted only seconds. Sid Agrawal, 56 years old and the man who had built Seaport from the ground up, was shot and killed. Vice President of Operations Brian Pugh, 47 years old, was shot and killed. Human Resources Manager Marilyn Lewis, 67 years old, was shot and killed. All 3 were found with gunshot wounds to the head. A witness who could see into Agrawal's office through a glass window spotted Wu with the weapon in his hand, scanning the room. When Wu moved toward the door, the witness shouted for everyone in the building to get out. Wu was arrested later that day. His subsequent trial lasted more than 2 months in a Santa Clara County courtroom. His defense team, led by prominent San Francisco attorney Tony Serra, argued that Wu suffered from a severe mental illness with roots in both his family history and his experiences growing up in communist China. The jury was presented with psychiatric testimony describing hallucinations, auditory disturbances, and a deteriorating grip on reality during the period surrounding the attack. The jury considered all of it, then they rejected it. On March 8, 2013, Jinghua Wu was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury also rejected his insanity plea. On August 2, 2013, Santa Clara County Superior Court Judge Sharon Chapman sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 75 years. He will never leave. 3 families were permanently altered. A startup that had quietly been building something meaningful was finished. And Silicon Valley's gleaming image of meritocracy and opportunity had, once again, revealed its other face. Case 5. Andrew John Engeldinger. Most people have, at some point in their working lives, received feedback they did not want to hear. A warning, a write-up, a performance review that stings. Most people absorb it, even if they resent it, and they keep showing up. They adapt. They adjust. They do what people do, which is find a way to carry on. But what happens when a person stops being able to do that? What happens when the gap between how someone sees themselves and how the world sees them becomes so wide, so painful, that there is simply no bridge left? Andrew John Engeldinger did not leave when the door was closed on him. He went to his car, retrieved a weapon he had brought with him to the meeting, and walked back inside. 13 minutes later, 6 people were dead, and Minnesota had recorded the worst workplace attack in its history. Andrew John Engeldinger was born around 1976 and raised in Richfield, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. He attended the Academy of Holy Angels, a private Catholic school, where classmates recalled him as quiet and largely unremarkable in social settings. After finishing school, he eventually found his way to Accent Signage Systems, a sign manufacturing company located on Chestnut Avenue West in the Bryn Mawr neighborhood of Minneapolis. The company produced interior signage and had developed a strong reputation in its industry under the leadership of its founder, Reuven Rahamim, a driven and exacting businessman who held his team to high standards. Engeldinger was trained as an engraver by a senior employee and, in the beginning, showed real promise. He caught on quickly, was described as conscientious and detail-oriented, and seemed to settle comfortably into the rhythms of the job. That was in the late 1990s. Over the following 12 years, something changed. Colleagues who worked alongside him watched him retreat further and further into himself. He stopped eating lunch with coworkers. He stopped taking breaks with anyone. He internalized feedback rather than addressing it, and the friction between him and management grew steadily. He clashed repeatedly with supervisors over tardiness and poor performance. Those who worked around him describe a man who always seemed to be operating under a private pressure that no one else could see or fully understand. His family later revealed that in the 2 years before September 2012, Andrew had withdrawn from them almost entirely. They believed he was living with an untreated mental illness and had tried, on multiple occasions, to encourage him to seek help. He refused every time. Quietly, during this same period, Engeldinger began arming himself. He legally purchased 2 Glock 9mm handguns. He registered for concealed carry training and received certification. He practiced regularly at a shooting range in Burnsville. Investigators who later searched his home found packaging that had once held 10,000 rounds of ammunition, alongside spare magazines, an ankle holster, and gun cleaning supplies. He had been preparing methodically for something. Whether he knew exactly what that something was, no one could say with certainty. But the evidence left behind told a story of a man who had stopped picturing a future and started planning an ending. On the afternoon of September 27, 2012, near the close of the workday, Engeldinger was called into the office of Operations Director John Suter. Also present was Senior Manager Rami Cooks, 62 years old. Suter informed Engeldinger that after 12 years of employment, he was being let go for poor performance and persistent tardiness. He handed Engeldinger his final paycheck. According to police reports, Engeldinger's response to the news was a quiet and almost casual expression of surprise. He said, simply, "Oh, really?" Then he reached down, drew his Glock from its holster, and the room became something else entirely. Both Suter and Cooks attempted to physically take the weapon from him. It was an act of enormous courage. Cooks was fatally wounded in the struggle. Suter, seriously injured, survived. Engeldinger moved out of the office and into the hallway, where he encountered company founder Reuven Rahamim stepping out to see what the commotion was. He shot him and continued moving through the building with disturbing calm, passing through a display area, a sales floor, and a loading dock. Employee Jacob Bennick, 34 years old, was killed. Ronald Edberg, 58 years old, was killed. Keith Basinski, 50 years old, a UPS driver who happened to be making a delivery and was seated in his truck at the loading dock, was also killed. Production manager Eric Rivers was critically wounded and succumbed to his injuries nearly 2 weeks later on October 10th. The first emergency calls reached dispatchers at 4:35 in the afternoon. The entire attack lasted under 15 minutes. When police entered the basement of the building, they found Andrew Engeldinger dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He had fired at least 46 rounds. 6 people were gone, families destroyed, and a community left with a grief that, years later, still had no good answer for why. Case 6. Jerome Spicer. There is a particular kind of rage that does not announce itself. It does not slam doors or raise its voice in the break room. It does not send threatening emails or make dramatic scenes in front of witnesses. It sits quietly at a desk, clocks in on time, does the work, and waits. What makes that kind of rage so dangerous is precisely what makes it so invisible. By the time anyone realizes it was ever there, it has already finished what it came to do. Jerome Spicer was, by most accounts, an unremarkable employee. He showed up. He did his job. He gave no one a reason to look twice. And then one morning in March of 2022, he walked into a trucking company in Burr Ridge, Illinois, and took the life of the man who ran it. What drove him to that moment is a story that builds slowly, the way pressure always does in places nobody thinks to check. Jerome Spicer was a truck driver employed at Winners Freight, a freight and logistics company located in Burr Ridge, Illinois, a quiet suburb situated approximately 20 miles southwest of downtown Chicago. Winners Freight was a family-operated business with a relatively small staff, the kind of company where employees and management knew each other by name, where the professional and the personal often overlapped in the way they tend to in tight-knit workplaces. Spicer had been part of that environment for some time before the events of March 22, 2022. He was not a new hire. He was not a stranger to the building or to the people inside it. In the days before the attack, Spicer had been informed that he was being let go. The specific reasons that management gave for his termination have not been made fully public, but what investigators established in the aftermath was that Spicer did not receive the news with acceptance. Something about losing that position, in that place at that point in his life, struck a nerve that ran far deeper than the job itself. For many people who work in the trucking industry, the job is not simply a paycheck. It is a schedule, a structure, a sense of purpose that organizes their days and defines their identity. When that is taken away, particularly without warning and without what feels like fairness, it can leave a person unmoored in ways that are not always visible from the outside. On the morning of March 22, 2022, Spicer arrived at the Winners Freight facility in Burr Ridge. He was not scheduled to be there. He had already been terminated. His presence at the building that morning was not a coincidence, and it was not a miscommunication. Investigators determined that his return was deliberate and purposeful. He entered the premises and located the owner of the company, Stan Winner, who was in his 60s and had spent years building the business that bore his family's name. Spicer confronted Winner and shot him. Stan Winner was pronounced dead at the scene. The attack was swift, targeted, and left no ambiguity about intent. What followed was a manhunt that stretched across multiple jurisdictions and kept the surrounding community on edge. Spicer fled the scene immediately after the attack and disappeared. Law enforcement from multiple agencies coordinated to locate him, tracking movements across the greater Chicago metropolitan area and beyond. An alert was issued, and investigators worked through the day, piecing together his route and his possible destinations. Hours after the shooting, authorities located Jerome Spicer. He was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had ended his own life before law enforcement could reach him, leaving investigators, the Winner family, and the broader Burr Ridge community with no trial, no courtroom testimony, and no direct account of what had pushed him past every boundary a person is supposed to hold. Stan Winner's death rippled outward in the way that losses in small, tightly connected workplaces always do. He was not an abstraction. He was not a symbol. He was a father, a business owner, a person whose employees had interacted with him, disagreed with him, worked alongside him, and known him as a real human presence. When that presence is removed in a matter of seconds by someone who once sat in the same building and shared the same daily routines, the grief is complicated in ways that take years to fully surface. Jerome Spicer left behind no manifesto, no detailed explanation, and no account of his reasoning. What he left, instead, was the particular silence that follows an act of violence committed by someone no one thought to watch closely enough, and the question that always lingers in that silence: what was it exactly that no one saw? Case 7. Tyrese Devin Haspel. There is a particular kind of trust that exists between an employer and the person they bring closest to their private world. Not a colleague down the hall, not someone behind a desk in a separate apartment. A personal assistant, someone who knows the passwords, handles the finances, rides in the same elevator, and is given access that most people never see. That kind of trust is rare. And when it is broken, the betrayal cuts in a direction most people never even think to guard against. Fahim Saleh was 33 years old, building companies across 2 continents, and changing lives on a scale that very few entrepreneurs his age ever reach. He trusted Tyrese Devin Haspel with nearly everything. That trust, extended even after it had already been violated once, became the very thing that cost him his life. Fahim Saleh was born in Saudi Arabia to Bangladeshi parents and moved with his family to the Poughkeepsie area of New York's Hudson Valley as a teenager. He attended John Jay High School in East Fishkill before eventually making his way to the technology world, where his drive and imagination set him apart quickly. He founded Prank Dial, a novelty calling app that became enormously popular, then invested in Patheo, one of the most well-funded startups in Bangladesh. His most prominent venture was Gokada, a motorcycle ride-hailing and delivery company he founded in Nigeria in 2017 that grew into a platform touching the daily lives of thousands of people. He was also a founding partner of Adventure Capital, a New York-based venture firm. Saleh was not simply a man who had made money. He was someone who moved through the world with visible joy, warmth, and a genuine belief that technology could lift people up. His colleagues described a person who was always positive, always building, always available for the people around him. That generosity extended even to those who had already shown him they did not deserve it. Tyrese Devin Haspel was a native of Long Island, New York, who had graduated from Central High School in Valley Stream in 2017 before briefly attending Hofstra University. Saleh hired him in May of 2018 as his executive assistant, placing him in direct control of financial records and business accounts. What Saleh did not know was that Haspel had previously been fired from a Long Island restaurant for stealing $20,000. He had padded his resume to land the position. Within months of being hired, Haspel began running 2 separate financial schemes against his employer, creating fake accounts and corporate entities to quietly funnel money out of Saleh's businesses. By the time the full picture emerged, he had stolen approximately $400,000. Investigators later established that much of that money was spent maintaining a lifestyle designed to impress a girlfriend, funding travel, luxury experiences, and the appearance of wealth that was never his. In January of 2020, Saleh discovered one portion of the theft, approximately $35,000. Rather than involve law enforcement, he sat down with Haspel, confronted him directly, and offered him a 2-year repayment plan. He gave a young man who had stolen from him a second chance that most employers would never consider extending. Haspel accepted the arrangement and paid back the detected amount using money he was simultaneously stealing from the second, still hidden scheme. The generosity meant nothing. The planning had already begun. On the morning of July 13, 2020, Haspel, dressed entirely in black, put on an opaque mask, carried a knife and a taser, and waited inside the stairwell of Saleh's luxury residential building on East Houston Street in Manhattan's Lower East Side. When Saleh returned from a morning run and stepped into the private elevator that opened directly into his 7th-floor condominium, Haspel followed him inside. As the elevator doors opened into the apartment, Haspel fired the taser into Saleh's back. Saleh fell to the floor and asked what was happening. Haspel then used a knife to fatally stab him multiple times in the neck and torso. He then spent time attempting to remove forensic evidence from the scene, using a small vacuum to collect identification discs discharged by the taser. He left to discard evidence and returned the following day with a purchased electric saw to further remove all trace of what he had done. He was interrupted when Saleh's cousin, who had not heard from him in 24 hours, arrived at the apartment and discovered what was there. Haspel fled. Police arrested him 4 days later at an Airbnb he had rented to celebrate his girlfriend's birthday. On June 24, 2024, a Manhattan jury convicted Tyrese Devin Haspel on all counts, including first-degree murder. The deliberations lasted just 3 hours. On September 10, 2024, he was sentenced to 40 years to life in state prison. In a moment that stunned the courtroom, Haspel himself told the judge that nothing less than a life sentence would be appropriate. Fahim Saleh's father, who had flown from Bangladesh, wept at the podium. His sister said she had no sympathy left to offer. The company Saleh built in Nigeria, the one he believed could transform lives, fell into chaos after his death and never recovered. Case 8. Afeni Badu Muhammad. Most people who have ever worked in fast food understand the particular kind of stress that comes with it. The orders that never stop. The customers who are never satisfied. The pressure of a lunch rush that hits like a wave and does not let up for 2 hours. Most people who work those shifts develop a thick skin, learn to move fast, and find a way to leave the tension at the door when they clock out. Whatever grievances build up during a shift, a disagreement with a manager, a scheduling conflict, a confrontation that did not go the way someone wanted, most workers find a way to process it and move on. What happened at a McDonald's in East Point, Michigan on July 10th, 2025 was not that. It was something that the people who witnessed it will likely never fully process, no matter how many years pass between that day and the moment they stop thinking about it. East Point is a small city in Macomb County, situated just north of Detroit on the border of suburban and urban Michigan. It is a working-class community where fast food restaurants are not just conveniences. They are employment anchors for a significant portion of the local workforce. The McDonald's franchise where this story unfolded was, by every visible measure, an ordinary location. Employees came in for their shifts, managers oversaw operations, and the rhythms of the day followed the familiar pattern of any franchise location across the country. Nothing about its exterior, its staff makeup, or its daily operations would have distinguished it from any other restaurant on any other block in any other American city. Afenai Badu Muhammad had been employed at the location and, according to investigators, had a documented history of conflict with the management there. The exact nature of those disputes has not been made fully public. But what emerged from the investigation in the days following July 10th was a picture of a workplace relationship that had deteriorated significantly over time. There had been tensions. There had been friction. There had been the kind of accumulating friction between an employee and a supervisor that, in most workplaces, eventually resolves itself one way or another. Either the employee moves on, or the relationship finds a workable equilibrium. What investigators established was that in Muhammad's case, neither of those outcomes had materialized. Instead, something else had been building beneath the surface, unseen and unchecked, until it finally broke through. On the afternoon of July 10th, 2025, Muhammad arrived at the McDonald's location in East Point. What unfolded inside that building in the minutes that followed resulted in the death of a manager who had come to work that day expecting nothing more than the ordinary pressures of running a fast food shift. The victim, whose name has been reported in Macomb County court records, was shot and killed inside the restaurant. The attack was not random. The victim was specifically targeted. Witnesses inside the location were present at the time of the shooting, and a scene that greeted East Point Police Department officers when they arrived was one that immediately made clear this was not an accident, not a robbery gone wrong, and not a case of mistaken identity. It was deliberate. It was personal, and it had been directed squarely at the person standing at the top of that particular workplace hierarchy. Muhammad was taken into custody by East Point Police in connection with the shooting. In the days that followed, Macomb County prosecutors formally charged him with first-degree premeditated murder. The charge itself carries enormous legal weight. First-degree premeditated murder in the state of Michigan requires prosecutors to establish not only that the accused committed the act, but that it was planned in advance, that the decision to take a life was made with forethought rather than in the heat of a spontaneous moment. The charging decision by the Macomb County Prosecutor's Office signals that investigators believe the evidence supports exactly that level of intent. Muhammad was subsequently bound over for trial in Macomb County Circuit Court. As of the time this story was compiled, the trial had not yet concluded, and a final verdict and sentence had not been rendered. The case remains active, and the full weight of its legal resolution still lies ahead. What is not ahead, however, is any version of a future for the manager who walked into that restaurant on July 10th, 2025, and did not walk out. Somewhere in Macomb County, a family is living with the specific and irreversible grief of having lost someone not to illness, not to accident, but to a choice made by a person who once worked in the same building and knew their name. That is a grief that does not follow any predictable timeline, and it does not wait for a courtroom to finish its work before it begins. Case 9. Gary Martin. Think about what it means to give 15 years of your life to a single employer. 15 years of early mornings and late shifts. 15 years of learning the rhythms of a building, memorizing the faces of your coworkers, becoming a fixture in a place until it feels less like a job and more like a second home. Most people who reach that milestone expect something in return. Not necessarily a plaque or a ceremony, but at minimum a sense of belonging, a quiet understanding that they have earned their place. What Gary Martin carried into the Henry Pratt Company on the afternoon of February 15th, 2019, was 15 years of history in that building and a weapon he had brought specifically because he already knew what the day held. He had suspected what was coming. He had prepared for it. And when the words were finally spoken out loud, everything that came next had already been decided. Gary Montez Martin was born on April 28, 1973, and spent much of his adult life in Aurora, Illinois, a city of roughly 200,000 people situated approximately 40 miles west of Chicago. He was employed at the Henry Pratt Company, a manufacturing facility that produced industrial valves and was owned by Mueller Water Products. The plant on Archer Avenue was a sprawling, 29,000-square-foot warehouse where workers moved among heavy machinery, stockrooms, and assembly lines. Martin had been part of that environment since 2004, 15 years that passed without ever placing him in a position of leadership, but that had made him a familiar presence on the floor nonetheless. Neighbors who lived near his apartment in the Acorn Woods condominium complex described a quiet loner who played with remote-controlled cars and drones in the parking lot. He kept largely to himself. He did not invite scrutiny. He gave most people around him very little reason to look closely. What those people did not know was that Gary Martin had a past that the system had failed to catch. In 1995, he had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault in Mississippi following an incident involving a former girlfriend. That conviction should have made him ineligible to legally own a firearm under federal law. But when Martin applied for an Illinois firearm owner's identification card in January of 2014, the Mississippi conviction did not surface in the database used for the background check. He was issued the card and purchased a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun from a licensed dealer in March of that same year. It was only when he subsequently applied for a concealed carry permit and submitted his fingerprints that a more thorough background check flagged the Mississippi record. His FOID card was revoked. He was ordered to surrender the weapon. He did not. The gun remained in his possession for nearly 5 years, and Illinois authorities never followed up to confirm it had been turned in. That failure of enforcement would cost 5 people their lives. On the morning of February 15, 2019, Martin arrived at Henry Pratt as usual. But something was different that day. He had reason to believe that a meeting scheduled for that afternoon was a termination meeting. He had accumulated multiple workplace violations, including failure to wear required safety glasses, and the company's progressive disciplinary process had reached its final step. Whether he was told directly or had simply read the signs, investigators later established that he came to work that day already armed. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, Human Resources Manager Clayton Parks, 32 years old, and Plant Manager Josh Pinkard, 37 years old, sat down with Martin in a private office. Also present were Human Resources intern Trevor Weiner, 21 years old, and on his very first day of work, Union Steward Timothy Williams and Mold Operator Russell Bayer, 46 years old, who had personally escorted Martin to the meeting. Parks told Martin he was being let go. Martin responded with profanity. Then he drew the handgun. Parks, Pinkard, and Weiner were fatally wounded in that room. Bayer and Williams attempted to intervene physically, an act of extraordinary courage. Bayer was fatally wounded. Williams was injured but survived. Martin moved out of the office and into the warehouse floor, where stockroom attendant Vicente Juarez, 54 years old, was shot and killed. A 6th employee sustained injuries but survived. Martin then took a position near the building's entrance, where he opened fire on the first officers to arrive on the scene, shooting 5 of them in the first few minutes of their response. None of those officers lost their lives. For the next 90 minutes, Martin moved through the depths of the warehouse as a multi-agency manhunt closed in around him. Officers finally located him in a machine shop at the far rear of the building. He fired at them. They returned fire. Gary Martin was shot 6 times and pronounced dead at 2:59 in the afternoon. Trevor Weiner had been at work for less than 2 hours. Case 10. Anthony Tote. There is a particular kind of man who is very good at being 2 things at once. On the outside, he is the husband everyone admires, the father at every school event, the community volunteer, the coach on the weekend sideline. On the inside, he is building a structure made entirely of lies, borrowing from one lender to pay another, billing for services never rendered, smiling at patients whose names he was already using to defraud the very system meant to protect them. Anthony John Tote was that man for years. And when the walls of everything he had secretly constructed finally began to close in around him, the people who paid the highest price were not the government agencies he had stolen from. They were the 4 people sleeping under his own roof. Anthony Tote was born in 1975 and grew up carrying a shadow most people never knew about. When he was just 4 years old, his father hired someone to harm his mother. The attack left her injured and his father imprisoned. It was a childhood defined by violence, betrayal, and the particular confusion of loving a parent who had done something incomprehensible. Whether those early years shaped the man he became is a question that forensic experts who later analyzed his case wrestled with openly. What is not a question is that Todt grew into someone who was extraordinarily skilled at concealment. He married his high school sweetheart, Megan, and the two built what appeared, from every visible angle, to be a full and admirable life. They opened family physical therapy in Colchester, Connecticut together, raised 3 children, Alec, Tyler, and little Zoe, and eventually began spending time in Celebration, Florida, a planned community adjacent to Walt Disney World that practically radiates the idea of the perfect American life. Anthony volunteered as a youth soccer coach. The children were involved in music. Neighbors waved from porches. The image was immaculate. Behind it, the business was drowning. Todt had been fabricating billing records for years, charging Medicaid, Cigna, Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and other insurers for hundreds of hours of physical therapy sessions that never took place. He once submitted claims for treating 16 children across 36 hours in a single day on a Saturday, when his office was not even open. He borrowed from more than 20 commercial lenders simultaneously, using fraudulent insurance reimbursements to service the loans, then borrowing again to stay ahead of what he owed. By the time federal investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services and the FBI launched a formal investigation in April of 2019, Todt owed more than $100,000 across multiple states. He was being evicted from his business premises in Connecticut. He was being evicted from the family's rental home in Celebration. He had stopped paying his own staff members, who had stopped showing up as a result. On November 21, 2019, federal agents raided his Connecticut offices and sat across from Anthony Todt in an interview. He admitted to the fraud. He said he had started adding charges because it was easier than finding another way to manage the debt. He told agents his wife knew nothing. He said he alone was responsible. Then he told investigators he would return from Florida to address his legal situation by December 8th. He never came back. He stopped answering calls. He stopped responding to his own attorney. A relative, growing increasingly concerned after weeks of silence, asked the Osceola County Sheriff's Office to conduct a welfare check at the Celebration home in late December. Officers went to the property. No one answered. They noted nothing alarming from the exterior and left. On January 13, 2020, federal agents arrived at the home on Reserve Place in Celebration to serve a federal arrest warrant. Anthony Todt was found inside. He told the officers that his wife was upstairs and that he believed she was sleeping. When authorities made their way to the upper floor, they found 4 bodies: Megan, 42, Alec, 13, Tyler, 11, and Zoe, 4 years old, all positioned in beds throughout the house, crucifixes placed in their hands. The family dog, Breezy, was found in her bed on the floor. Based on the state of the home and the evidence, investigators believed the family had been gone since late December of 2019. Todt had been living in the house with them for weeks. He later confessed multiple times, then recanted, then blamed his wife for the deaths, then claimed he could not remember. On April 14, 2022, after 7 hours of deliberation, a jury in Osceola County found Anthony John Todt guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. Moments after the verdict was read, Judge Keith Karsten looked directly at him and said, simply, that he was a destroyer of worlds. He was sentenced that same evening to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at Santa Rosa Correctional Institution Annex in Florida's Panhandle, where he will remain until he dies.